Hello, and welcome to The Resource, the podcast propelling employer brands to recruit smarter and retain better. I'm your host, Priscilla Peters.
And I'm your other host, Scott Dismuke. Priscilla, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. We survived the holidays, Scott.
Yeah,
I think you did. We haven't actually seen each other in person since the new year.
Well, we talked right before Christmas about our favorite movies, and I think you mentioned that one of yours was Four Christmases. Yeah, so I had 6 this Christmas with all of the different families that we have.
Oh gosh, you had 6.
I had 6. Yeah. So we started on the 23rd. So we had a Christmas on the 23rd, the 24th. We had 2 on actual Christmas Day, and then one the day after and one 2 days after. Now, thankfully, I didn't have to, get up and sing like Vince Vaughn did during the, when he went to the church. But I'll be honest with you, I was done. I was done with Christmas, man. Six Christmases is about probably about 2-3 too many.
It's a lot. We had a good one. We have 6 children as a blended family that we are. So we had all the kids here, even we call them our bigs, the older ones that are out of the house. And so we had everybody here, and it was just great. And then Stella and I took a little trip to New York between Christmas, and we skedaddled out of New York City right before the new year because we didn't want to be any part of that. And that was really fun.
Did you go to see the Rockefeller Christmas tree?
We did. And listen, I don't know if I've ever told you, but I'm really claustrophobic.
I did not know that.
Okay. Like death, like I have to breathe because I'm short. Let me tell you, the worst claustrophobic moment I've ever had was at Neyland Stadium. Arkansas was playing Tennessee. And it's Neyland, right? That's okay. So when you walk, it's like 400,000 years old. Great stadium, but it's old. When you walk through those tunnels and you're leaving the game with 100,000 people, and you can't. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. You got to kind of curve around a little bit. Let me just tell you, I'm 5'2". Okay. So when there's that many people and we're all squinched in a tunnel, I looked at Kobe and I was like, nope, I can't. And he's like, listen, you gonna go. Come on, sis. But anyway, that being said, Rockefeller Christmas tree, first night we got there, it was like Neyland Stadium. And I was like, okay, if this is the way this whole trip is going to be, I'm going to go, hang out.
Get me out of here.
But it wasn't. That was the only night that it was like everybody in New York City wanted to see the tree. But it was great.
Yeah, and New York can be kind of claustrophobic. I mean, anytime you have to look straight up to see, blue sky.
That's true.
I don't know I think I've told you, my wife lived there for about 18 months before we got married. And so when I would go visit, growing up in small Southeast Missouri, I didn't have any trouble seeing blue sky, but when you had to look straight up for blue sky, that took me a while to get used to. So that can be a claustrophobic city.
Yeah, I do love New York, though. I mean, we had been before. I had just never been between Christmas and New Year, and that's a whole nother deal, just so you know. Yeah. But it was great. We did the Rockettes. We did a couple of Broadway shows. Like, we fit it all in. I walked 476,000 steps. Like, it was great. But we had fun. It was a lot of fun.
Did you get to watch any football?
Yeah. So, when we got back, that's pretty much all I did until.
Same here.
Yes. And then, does it feel weird that an SEC team didn't end up on top?
Oh, listen, we could do a whole podcast on the whole playoff, Final Four. I mean, obviously Michigan won and they looked good at doing it. I've got some friends and family that are Florida State fans that were pretty ticked off.
Oh, I'd be in jail. If I was a Florida State fan, I would be in jail right now.
But I'll tell you, I think, I do think Florida State had a legitimate gripe. I think Georgia had a legitimate gripe, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, they went from number 1 to number 6 or number 7 after losing to Alabama on a neutral field at the SEC championship.
Yeah.
I clearly think they took their frustration out on Florida State in the Orange Bowl for sure. But man, I think if we learned anything, 2 things I think we learned during these football bowls and playoffs is, number 1, it's a good thing we're going to a 12-team playoff, so we don't get as much of the arguments. And we got to figure out a way to not allow players to opt out.
Right.
So we have a situation like we had at the Orange Bowl. I mean, that was just awful.
I mean, otherwise, why are we gonna these companies that sponsor these bowls are not gonna pony up those
No.
dollars if that's what it's gonna look like.
Hey, I got one for you. I actually read this today. I read this today on Twitter. So, or X, whatever they're calling it these days. So there's a group of people, and I don't know who they are, but this was reported by Darren Ravel, who's a business reporter, I want to say for Bloomberg or for USA Today. There's a group of people that are pushing a new bowl game next year called the Irrelevant Bowl. And the goal is to have the two worst teams in football play one another in the Irrelevant Bowl. And all they're looking for right now is a location to have it. So they put in this article that the two teams that would have been in the Irrelevant Bowl this year would have been Akron, who was 1-11, and Vanderbilt, who was 2-10.
Oh wow. Oh, poor
And
baby.
I'm like, if they have that bowl game, inject it into my veins, I am going to watch
Yeah.
the two worst teams. But, you know, I mean, like who, you know, where would you have that? And somebody asked me, do you think you would watch? I'm like, absolutely, I would watch that. It's a
Oh
football
yeah.
game, but I would absolutely watch that.
And it'd probably be a train wreck, which would be even better, you know?
But I've already found them a sponsor. If you're going to have the two worst teams, you need to have like a vacuum cleaner, like Hoover, right? I mean, you the two teams that suck. You got to have the Hoover Irrelevant Bowl and have vacuum cleaners everywhere. I think it'd be
Yeah,
awesome.
Scott, you're onto something there. Well, listen, I'm excited to be back at it. I'm excited to just kind of we're still in this first season of the resource, but this has been fun. We're about halfway through. So um it's exciting. It's exciting. I think our guest today is gonna be great.
Yeah. Aren't you getting ready for the recruiting and retention conference?
Yes. Yes, we are. Listen, with recruiting and retention conference, everything's going great. I always tell people when I come back from the holidays, like the next 6 weeks for me is just straight up R&R planning. So that's what I've been kind of buried in these first few weeks of January. It's going great. We're really close to selling out. Annualrrconference.com is where you can go if you want to register. But it's great. We have some amazing speakers. Remember, Chris Tuff was on our December episode. He's going to be great. He's doing a keynote about driver retention. And then we have lots of great speakers on AI and what's going on with AI and recruiting, which a lot of people are wanting to know about. And just lots of, carrier panels, lots of opportunities to network. So yeah, encourage all the listeners and viewers to register for that. It'll be here really
Yeah.
soon.
All right. So, Priscilla, I think we can tell everybody for the February podcast, we're going to talk about our annual report. So, we've put that out the last couple of years. But then in March, we're going to interview a bunch of people in February at the R&R conference that we're going to put out in March. Several people that are going to be there. We want to get, kind of a mishmash of people that are going to be in attendance. So, I think the March episode is going to be pretty cool to have several people on that'll be attending the conference, find out what kind of what they're thinking about, what they're hearing in the industry, and have them on for the March episode of the podcast.
Yes, I think those episodes are going to be great. So, speaking of episodes, let's dive into this one.
Yeah, I think we're gonna kick it off right this year. Obviously, 23 has been an interesting year, so we wanted to have somebody kick off the podcast this year. Maybe kind of talking about where we've been and where we're going. And so we're going to have Thom Albrecht on. So why don't we bring Thom on? All right, everybody. We are really, really excited for our guest today on the resource. We have the privilege of sitting down with Thom Albrecht. He is the current CFO and Chief Revenue Officer at Reliance Partners. And he has an extensive career in the transportation industry dating back to 1988. He was a 7-time Wall Street Journal All-Star and 8 times recognized as best analyst in his sector among regional and boutique firms by Institutional Investor magazine. He has presented to shipper teams at Kellogg's, General Mills, Schneider, Crete, J.B. Hunt, and Old Dominion, just to name a few. And he brings a wealth of experience to our discussion, as we are honored to have him on the resource to provide some invaluable insights into the current state of the freight market and what he is going to see in 2024. And we're going to hope that it's a little bit better than it was in 2023. So, Thom, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Scott, and I'm delighted to talk about what I think is going to eventually become a better year.
We are so excited to get your insight, Thom. I got to tell you, we always start with what we call the first five. These are serious questions that seriously do not matter. And Scott, I'm I'm thinking Thom he's up here. Like these questions may take this whole conversation to another lower level. You know what I'm saying? But we're going to kick it off this way, Thom. This is just a way for us to kind of get to know you and
Sure.
all of that. So we're going to kick off with our first five. So our first question for you out of these very serious questions is, in your opinion, what is the best sandwich?
Well, anything with chicken. So, for example, I'm not necessarily a big Reuben person. I love burgers. Burgers to me are more of a summer item, but all sorts of chicken combination sandwiches I absolutely love. It could be chicken bacon and ranch, chipotle chicken, any sort of variety of sauces that are on there. Chicken goes a long way in my appetite satisfaction.
Fantastic. So, Thom,
Chicken salad.
there you go.
Yeah.
Hey, very, very popular in the South for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
So, what is your favorite movie?
Well, again, it depends on the category, but let's see. From a comedy perspective, it's one that came out a little before my time, but my dad loved it. It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, early 1960s. It's incredible. And then when I was a little kid, there was a movie called What's Up, Doc? From an adventure perspective, you can't go wrong with any of the Indiana Jones ones. Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first one's my favorite. And then, kind of a boutique movie. I think it came out around 2010, Bottle Shock. It's a little bit more of a drama about how a U.S. vineyard took first place in an international wine competition and really put Napa Valley on the map, based upon a true story around 1976, but it's a more recent movie. So that's a long litany.
Yeah. So did you like the last Indiana Jones movie?
Not as much.
Yeah.
So the first three were particularly good.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I love how you have seasons for your sandwiches. You have categories for your movies. Like I'm here for all this, Thom. And I was gonna say, isn't there like everybody's talking about this series on Netflix about the vineyard, the guy who inherits the vineyard and the daughter and the guy. I don't know. Have you watched that, Thom? Have you seen that? I don't even know what it's called.
I'm not sure. I've heard people talk about it, but I've
we'll
not
figure
watched
out
it.
what that is.
Yeah.
We'll put it in the show notes. It's on my to watch list. So, okay. The next question is, what is the most used app on your phone?
It would be a couple of different ones. Well, number one would be The Athletic, which is the premier sports writing app in the world. If viewers don't know about The Athletic, essentially as local newspapers have struggled over the last 15 years, The Athletic has hired one or two of the best sports writers in every sports city in the country. And their coverage of everything sports is phenomenal, whether it be golf. The college football coverage is unbelievable. They have dedicated writers to most of the top 25 teams. They cover the recruiting angles. They do an incredible job on Major League Baseball, the NFL. So that one gets opened a lot. There's another one, of course, the Wall Street Journal. And then there's kind of an oddball one called Zero Hedge. It's actually I don't know if they have an app, but I go to it 5 or 6 times a day. It's sort of a libertarian view on the financial markets and economic policy. It's an incredible read, Zero Hedge. So those are kind of my top 3.
Listen, I'm making notes. Like, I did not know about the sports one. Did you know about that, Scott?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Why? How did I not know that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. Now you gotta pay for the athletic content though.
Well,
Yeah.
Isn't that right, Tom? It's a subscription based.
It's $6 a month, but because things have slowed down in the last year, I've turned a few friends onto it. They've been able to get on as low as $2 a month. So not even the cost of a Starbucks coffee. So it's well worth it. I mean, the in-depth stories, so the feature stories are deeper. And then when there's analysis, it's unlike anything you would get through a traditional source like ESPN or when the old USA Today used to be around, things like that.
I love it.
Here's another one for you, Tom. What is a talent that you have that only those close to you know about?
It's certainly not singing.
That's Scott's, Tom. I don't know if you knew that, but that's Scott's.
No, Tom does not know that, but he does now.
Well, boy, that's a good question. Well, so I'm an avid golfer. Most people know that. I still enjoy tennis. I won the intramural tennis tournament back in college. I don't think most people know that. So that's kind of a fun one. And then I was a radio disc jockey. So maybe that's one of the reasons why I get asked to do industry speeches and things like that. I certainly enjoy the microphone.
So what is your course that you play at down in Chattanooga?
I play all over. I've actually not joined a private club. When I lived in Virginia, I belonged to a couple, but there's really a lot of good ones. And so I just kind of piggyback on friends that belong to whether it be Chattanooga Country Club or one of the other ones around there.
Yeah, I've played. Have you played Black Creek? I've played it once.
I played it a handful of times. Council Fire, the same. I actually enjoy going kind of all around. Different weekends, I may go to Western North Carolina. There's a club I'm thinking about joining on an out-of-town basis this spring in Waynesville that was just completed a 2-year renovation in July. So that's a possibility. And I still get back to the Midwest for about a month each year. And so there's a handful of courses around the St. Louis area.
So anybody that lives in and around the Chattanooga area that plays golf, I always have to know, have you got to play the honors course yet?
Oh, yes. I first played that probably 2001. And I've got a couple friends out there and, usually get on 1 to 3 times a year.
That's awesome.
It is very special.
Very cool. Okay, one last question as part of our first 5 is if you weren't doing what you're doing today, your job, your career, what would you hope to be doing?
I'd love to be a pro golfer, but I wasn't good enough. So I do not want to be a club pro, though. Those folks work really hard, but unfortunately, they don't get to play that much golf. So, maybe as I move towards retirement, beginning of the next decade, I'll be sort of a hobby teacher for a park and recreation division. I might not mind being a school teacher. Actually, another little known fact was in 1986, before I got on at A.G. Edwards, my first career job, I was a substitute school teacher for about 10 weeks, taught everything from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade computer science. So had a lot of fun with that.
Nice. That's been kind of a common answer. We've gotten teacher a couple of times. Okay, real quick. I want to go back to your intramural tennis championship. So here's my question. Can we put that on our resume? Because I don't know, Scott, I've never told you this, but I played, you're going to die. I played intramural football, flag football in college. And can you guess what position I played? We won the championship.
Yeah, I really hope it was quarterback.
No, it was not. It was defensive line. Okay. Because believe it or not, I was quick and I would just go around and I would rip that flag quarterback and it got nasty. And I played for the Baptist Student Union. And so obviously they didn't want us to cuss, which, from time to time might accidentally come out. And anyway, but I love that you said that, Tom. You're like, I was the intramural champion. So I feel like I could say that now. Like I could be like, I was on the intramural, women's.
As long as I don't have to put the year that I won that in.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it was a lot of fun. I didn't play high school tennis, but always played recreationally, and then got to know some guys on the tennis team and was able to sharpen my game quite a bit. Got a mean backhand and always believed in a huge power serve.
There you go. Well, little known fact, and Priscilla, I don't even know if you know this. My freshman year of college, I went to school on a tennis scholarship.
Really? I did not know
Wow.
that.
Yep. Union University in Jackson, Tennessee.
Look at us. We're athletes. We didn't even know it. Look at us. All right. Well, okay. So now we're going to dive into our actual real questions. Scott, you want to kind of kick it off? What we have for him?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Thom, obviously, really wanted to have you on today. Aside from knowing, the tennis and golf side of things, which I could talk about for hours. Obviously, your background in the industry and everything that the industry has been through in the last year and kicking off 2024 and kind of where things going. So, in leading up to this interview and our discussions, you had kind of made mention that your theme for 2024 is the march back to equilibrium. So would you kind of expand on that a little bit and maybe speak to whether you think the freight market will flip a switch, or will it be more of a gradual recovery?
No, that's I think everybody's thinking about that. And so, first of all, we're in this mess because we have too much capacity. So we need to get back to where supply and demand are at equilibrium. Demand is roughly in line with the number of trucks on the road, and there's still excess capacity. So I do believe what we're going to see is a very challenging January and February. Although I've already heard from a few fleets that there's been a little bit of a bounce so far to start the year, but I don't put too much stock in January. January used to be the worst freight month in the calendar year, and about 15 years ago, it became a sort of decent month with the proliferation of gift cards. About 70% of those are spent in the first 35 days or so. So retailers like to make sure there's something in stock. And then with the Chinese New Year always being in February, there tends to be some extra orders in January because there's not going to be much flowing into the ports in February. So January is not too bad. February tends to be a real stinker. So I think it will be challenging. And then I do think we're going to see a few green sprouts in either May or June, where there's a sense of, you know what, maybe the worst is finally starting to be behind us. And I think there will be clear evidence in the second half of the year that if we're not at equilibrium, we're not very far away. What I've been telling people is this year starts the opposite of the phrase. The phrase people use sometimes is in like a lion, out like a lamb. Well, I think we're going to be in like a lamb, but maybe out like a lion by the end of the year. It's almost like a musical crescendo where you start very low and moderate and gradually build tempo and volume. That's how I view this year. And I think there's going to be a clear sense that 2025 is a pretty special year.
Interesting. I can see exactly kind of your take on that. One of the questions I have related to that equilibrium is do you see us getting to that primarily through freight, through attrition, through both? Like, how do we get there?
It'll primarily be through what's happening on the capacity side. The demand side is not going to be anything special this year. Now, I will say a couple things. If we go back to where we were a year ago, it is going to be a little bit better of a freight environment. Freight should be reasonably stable. And when there's volatility this year, for example, it should be volatility that helps motor carriers. So, for example, what's going on in the Red Seas and the drought in the Panama Canal and the upcoming labor negotiations with some of the East Coast ports means that there's probably going to be a little bit more freight out on the West Coast. And of course, the West Coast has gone through a couple of really difficult years between their own labor negotiations and the massive destocking. The destocking story for probably 75, 80% of the companies is largely over. There's still a few companies that are going through that. So stable is probably a word that we can start thinking about, even if it's not quite at the absolute volumes motor carriers want. And then the kind of volatility that we will see this year is the volatility that tends to create a little bit of chaos favorable to motor carriers, whereas last year's volatility was just essentially a free fall and a never-ending inventory destocking that clearly favored the shipping community.
You mentioned the Red Sea, and obviously that's something that we've been hearing a lot of. How long does that have to occur to dramatically affect how things are going on now from a freight standpoint, or were we already there?
Well, I think we're already there. I think the question is, what's the duration? What's the shift? We all know that some of the alternative routes take longer. And so I think what will be hitting the ports, we haven't even really seen much in the way of diversion volumes yet. I think that'll be forthcoming in the next 2 to 3 weeks. But again, volatility is more often than not fairly good for the motor carrier community, whether it's weather volatility, uh, federal government regulations that have done things to hours of service, ELDs, any sort of thing that takes away the steady, predictable has a chance to remind the shipping community that while the trucking industry looks like a basic commodity, it still has aspects of being a precious commodity. And I think that got lost in the shuffle last year.
Yeah, and I was curious as you're kind of thinking about us getting to this equilibrium, do you feel like there's going to be impact on specific fleet sizes? In other words, like I just think because a lot of some of the smaller fleets kind of depend on spot market or things like that. So I just wonder what your take is on how the industry as a whole might look on the other side of that equilibrium.
Well, so first of all, if we look at the capacity growth that occurred from, let's say, the second half of 2020 through about mid 2022, about a 2 year period, it was overwhelmingly in the small motor carrier community, whether you call that 1 to 9, 1 to 20, whatever it is. It was all on kind of the micro end of the marketplace. And at Reliance Partners, we work with over 8,000 motor carriers, 400 freight brokers. We have the largest market share in the 1 to 20 arena. We have the largest in the 1 to 100 arena. And it's not an either or. We also have a couple customers with 1,000 trucks and quite a few between 500 and 1,000. So we kind of like it all, but we have a unique perspective into the SMB or small to mid-sized part of the market. And I think the media has been sitting around, I'm not going to name the various media sources, but there's 3 or 4 go-tos within the trucking world. And they keep waiting for this plethora of bankruptcies, whether it's a 200 truck fleet or 1,000 truck fleet. And some of that has been occurring, and those venues have done a pretty good job in picking up on that. But just as they couldn't see the massive buildup in the 1 to 20 arena on the way up, we can see it. I'm hesitant to give too many specific numbers, but let me tell you that the number of motor carriers going out of business over the last 6 or so quarters is 5 times larger in the micro arena than what a normal trend would be. Now, there's always going to be some folks coming and going, but it's been 5x. And we believe that the number of casualties at the low end of the market is substantially higher. So, for example, when I look at FMCSA data on licensed and insured for hire active motor fleets, so that you got to have the insurance to be active. If you don't click on that button, then you're going to get a much higher motor carrier picture. But we've seen 19% of the drivers through the end of October and from the May 2022 peak leave the industry. And we've seen over 15% of the fleets. Now, we still have some room to go, but if this run rate continues somewhere between March and June, there's going to be fewer drivers in the industry than existed in December of 19, just a few months before the pandemic really took its grip. So at the end of the day, it's all about the drivers. We can look at fleet registrations and revocations, but to me, that 19% figure, and I can't wait to get the new number for beginning of December. That should come out in the next 2 or 3 market days. I've got kind of a proprietary resource there.
Interesting. So over the last few years, the industry, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but the industry's kind of lived through the extremes. So we had the COVID shutdown, we had the COVID freight boom. Now we're kind of in the post-COVID slowdown. Do you think that part of regaining that equilibrium means also going back to kind of our normal, seasonal peaks and valleys? And maybe do you see any kind of parallels with previous years in that instance?
Yeah. So let me give a little more specific number. On that driver front, over 700,000 drivers have left the industry, which is a lot more than I think even folks that want to be bullish understand. Now that's for hire, and that includes not only truckload and all its niches, but less than truckload, final mile companies that do interstate, not intra. So keep all that in mind. It's not just one view on like the dry van truckload arena, but I think directionally it's important. So do I see parallels with another year? Absolutely. 2017. So let's go back in time. 14 was a big freight party, if you will, a confluence of factors from regulatory to weather, plus 3 years of a pretty mediocre environment, 11, 12, 13, where capacity was slowly being pruned. And then we had this ginormous year in 14. 15 started like the party was continuing, but clearly by the end of March, early April of 15, it was clear that party was coming in. And so what we saw is then became a very brutal environment. The last, 8 months of 15, all of 16. And then as we morph into 17, shippers were still trying to drive down rates in their contract negotiations the first 2, 3 months of the year. And then what happened was there was a little bit of a whiff that capacity had been exiting, and we saw it kind of in May and June. There was a robustness to things that surprised people. And then in that fall, we had the huge hurricane down in Houston. We had the ELD mandate in mid-December of 17. I see a lot of parallels there. We don't have any huge regulatory issues per se on the horizon, but there's so much capacity leaving. And again, our insights are very different than others. I'm telling you that, in one year, during that 2-year boom, there were 106,000 fleets added. They represented about 170,000 trucks, so about 1.6 trucks per. Most of those fleets have gone poof. And it won't be long. We're not much more than 100,000 or so drivers away from the market being pretty doggone close to equilibrium. I forgot if there was another aspect to your question.
No, we were kind of talking about the being part two of back to equilibrium. Does that kind of also mean back to our normal seasonal peaks and valleys?
Well, there's always a little bit of seasonality, but I don't really know what normal is anymore. Chaos is normal. Since 2003, when the announcement of the first hours of service revision was made mid-year, we've only had in 21 years now, because you have to count 03 through 2023, we've only had 3 years that were sort of tame, where maybe you got a price increase, maybe you gave back 1.5%. And those were the years of 2011, 12, and 13. Everything else has just been extreme volatility on the upside if you're a motor carrier and you view it through the lens of a bull market or an extreme bear market. That's the new normal, chaos. So really what motor fleets have to do is they need to be asking themselves, what do we need to do to be ready, get in the ready position, if you will, for the second half of 2024?
So you said something earlier about rates, and we all know that also has been part of the freight recession side of things. Do you have any data? Or are you hearing anything on rates? And do we see those going back up? What are you hearing from that side of things?
Well, I do believe we will see a little bit of an inflection in the spot market. Again, here we are on whatever it is, January 10th. You can't read too much into January at all. It could feel really good or worse than normal. We have to let the year play out. But the first thing to move will be the spot market. I think that could have a little bit of a blip upwards in May or June. Maybe if we're lucky, even a little bit in March, although I don't want to get too far ahead. But I think clearly as we get into the spring shipping season, there will be, again, some green sprouts like, wait a minute, this is starting to feel like maybe my, hangover of the last 2 years is finally moderating. And here's another way I look at it, Scott, and everyone. We had about a 2-year binge. And the way I look at it is, call it July 1st of 2020. Now, it's not that exact, but, we had the big lockdown throughout March, April into mid-May, depending upon what state, second half of May and throughout June, different states were reopening. Truckers were almost immediately fairly busy trying to get drivers back and a whole bunch of stuff. But, let's just call it July 1st, the official kind of beginning. Well, if we go back to 2022, the spot market rolled over 6 weeks before the Ukraine invasion on February 24th. So the small carriers were feeling it. That exacerbated those problems. The large motor carriers throughout that spring, summer, they viewed the market as normalizing. And then finally, the larger enterprise carriers, those that do 3 or more services for shippers, they finally used the 4-letter word slow after Labor Day. So if we kind of divide, early in the year for the micro fleets, those depended on more of the spot market, and those contract carriers kind of early fall, we'll just say around June 30th of 2022, the bull market ended. So it was a 2-year boom. It only makes sense that it takes about 2 years to kind of work off those excesses. And that's partly why, I'm talking about May and June, some of the first green sprouts.
Interesting. Now, I mean, I'm sitting here taking notes like crazy, Scott. I don't know about
Me
you.
too. Me too.
Like, can we just talk to you every month, Tom? This is great information.
Only until I'm wrong.
Honestly, I love your adjective of chaos
Yep.
because I mean, as someone who's lived through it, and it does feel a little chaotic, but to be honest, the chaos does seem normal,
Yep.
and so I think that's a great way to kind of describe it. So when you're thinking about trucking companies and how they're looking at being profitable, because we know like recently, the earnings reports and everyone is being challenged with their OR and how they're operating their businesses. Is that a side effect, do you think, of the economy and rates? I know we talked about those two factors. Are there any other factors that you think are coming into play on the challenge of being profitable as a carrier today?
Sure. I mean, one thing people often point to is insurance, but in our perspective, that's not a real issue right now. I think the excess coverage market continues to be challenging, but for the 1 to 100 truck fleet, they primarily operate or carry the minimum $1 million of coverage. Technically, it's 750,000, but no underwriters do that really anymore. It's $1 million of coverage because there have been so many motor carrier failures in that space. Most of the underwriters have significant capacity. As my CEO says to me, I've been in the business over 20 years. I've never seen underwriters so willing to play price or modify their underwriting standards to win business. They've got capacity. So that this is a rare window where insurance can help, but there's still inflationary pressures on the cost of new and slightly used equipment, whether it's tractors or trailers. Yes, they've come down from the peaks, but they're not exactly bargain basement prices. I think ultimately, though, it's just the rate pressure is the single biggest thing. And networks are out of whack. There's always added cost when the equipment's not where you need it to be. And that's why the capacity purge is the most important thing to be looking at through different numbers.
So, Tom, many of our listeners, viewers are kind of in the recruiting retention space. We've talked a lot about the economy and everything, and I know you've been through several freight slowdowns and recessions during your time in the industry. What are your thoughts on the recruiting retention side of things during an economic slowdown, and how do you think carriers can best be prepared for the inevitable rebound or equilibrium that we've been talking about?
Well, I've been around this crazy industry since 1988. The driver narrative is just a part of the industry. I mean, if you live in Buffalo, New York, or Erie, Pennsylvania, you better expect snow. So if you operate in and around trucking, and so obviously Reliance is a vendor to trucking. So whether you're a vendor to it or directly in it, it's just part of it. So I think the smartest thing to do is upgrade the quality of your drivers as much as possible. Safe drivers, reliable drivers, but know full well you're not going to keep them all. So when you begin to lose drivers and the market turns, then your focus needs to be on monetizing the cycle. And it's that simple. I haven't heard anyone that can truly solve driver turnover. There's some fleets that do an outstanding job and have turnover kind of in that 35 to 40% range. But most fleets, they just remain very reactive. And I think the challenge for every company in trucking is how do we develop more of a forward-looking mindset? Because it just amazes me how many people are reactionary. And then let's say the second half of the year plays out the way I described earlier. Well, there's folks that are going to be surprised by what happens to drivers. Well, really? I mean, we only have, decades of history, and nobody's been able. I mean, there's a lot of scientific breakthroughs that we've seen, whether it be cancer, baldness, whatever. But I mean, nobody solved the driver problem per se. And the only good thing I could say about the pandemic relative to trucking, and I hope this doesn't sound insensitive because it was a horrible period for everyone, but trucking's been screaming about the job market, labor availability, the quality of the workforce for 20 to 30 years now. The pandemic allowed everyone to realize that's not only true for trucking, that's true for just about every industry in America. So until we get immigration reform, which I do think we need, we just don't have enough people. The demographics just don't work. So I could try to make up some pithy statement, but just be more forward thinking and expect what's to come. Take advantage of what you've got now to upgrade your driver base.
And just kind of a follow up to that, because we're in a soft freight period, what would you recommend to carriers from a driver standpoint? There's some that think, oh, I just don't need to recruit at all now. And then some think I need to recruit, like you said, to really kind of improve the quality of the drivers that I have so that I am kind of prepared. What's your take on that?
Well, I think you always need to be in a little bit of a recruiting mode. Again, I go back to, let's say, some of the underwriters, without naming names, but some of them during the bull market, had very strict underwriting standards. They wouldn't insure any fleets that had drivers less than 2 years of driver experience or driving experience. A lot of those have compromised that down to 1, in some cases, maybe 6 months. That's not going to last. But if you're a motor carrier, you should be talking to your insurance broker about, hey, what's going on in the marketplace? If we do upgrade our driver base a little bit, because there clearly are some drivers that are outstanding already, and they've only got 7 or 8 months of driving experience up to that 2-year mark. That's a conversation you need to be having. Take advantage of that window now. I don't know that I have a whole lot of other thoughts there, but just think outside of the way you've thought about things in past cycles. It would probably be the best way to put it. I don't want to say think outside of the box because that's too much of a cliche, but we get tied to the same thinking throughout the cycles. Here's how our playbook in a bull market. Here's our playbook in a downturn. And, people can't break free. People need to be thinking about the recovery right now. I heard this from a really smart person about 2.5 years ago. And he said, there's 4 things that you have to think about relative to the business cycle. And I don't care whether it's trucking, widget making, a service business, you have to prepare to thrive, then you thrive, prepare to endure, and then endure, and then rinse and wash or rinse and repeat all over again. And you keep going through these things. And so, right now it's still the endurance phase, the reality. But somebody in your organization needs to begin to think about, okay, prepare to thrive. What does that mean from an equipment perspective, from an insurance perspective, from what we're doing to recruit people? What IT projects do we have? For example, fleets oftentimes, they have these waterfall of loads that are tendered every day. Well, when the market is better, so let's say 2025 is as strong as I've kind of hopefully articulated, you have a program in place that says, wait a minute, if we get the same load tendered 3 times in a day, is somebody in our organization picking up the phone and calling that shipper? Because that means they didn't get anybody to cover it. That means you've got some price leverage right there. Instead of just, okay, we send our drivers out between 6:30 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. And it's just, really, there's a lot of little things. Trucking's always been about nickels and dimes. And unfortunately, it's never going to be about mega dollars in terms of huge margins. But you can do things that can, get your margins to set records each cycle.
Well, Thom, I got to tell you, man, I've really, really appreciate your time. I don't know if anybody else has learned a lot today, but I sure have. I've been writing like crazy. So the information you've given us today has just been fantastic. And I will agree with Priscilla, if we can entice you to come back on, we will definitely have you on to talk more about this, because I've learned a lot today, and just really appreciate your time. Appreciate you joining us. And
Scott, can I leave one more thought that's a
absolutely
positive thought here? So everybody's bearish on housing. I've been bearish on housing since the end of 2021 in terms of our internal organization. I'm actually starting to get fairly positive. So there's two types of housing in terms of sales. I'm not talking about housing selections. You have existing home sales and then new starts, or the building of new homes. So, for example, existing home sales have been negative on a year-over-year basis for 28 months. November was the smallest decrease at 7.3% year over year. And we're going to see existing housing sales turn positive somewhere between March and June. Right now, they're running at about 3.8, 3.9 million annualized sales. That's actually below the level they bottomed at in the great financial crisis during the housing crisis, 08, 09. They bottomed out at 4.1 million. We're going to see people, they're starting to get used to higher interest rates. We're going to see some layoffs. So people are going to be forced to sell either due to affordability or they have to move to a different city. Mortgage rates are going to come down a little bit. How much, I don't know, but where they are today versus where they're going to be this summer, this fall, they're going to be a little bit better. So what happens is, so let's say the first half of the year, we sell at an annualized rate of 3.9 million existing home sales. And the second half of the year, let's say it's 4.5 million. Well, the peak was 6.5. You can either fixate on the 4.5 being down from the peak, or you can say, wait a minute, that's a big jump from 3.9. And so I think on a year over year basis, that turns positive. Housing starts the last 3 months. So the building of new homes have surprised by about 100,000 a month, partly because there's not enough existing homes for sale. So we're seeing some raw material cost components begin to come down. Housing is going to be at least a modest contributor in the second half of the year, and potentially a fairly meaningful contributor in 2025.
That's great.
But the consensus is still it's a bear market. Well, 28 months. By the time we get to May of 2024 here, June, that'll have been a bear market for 35 months, 3 years.
Well, I think we want to maybe have you back on the middle of the year, and let's see where we are on the equilibrium front.
Sure.
I'm like you. I hope we're there. I know there's a lot of folks that are listening today that hope we're there to get back in a weird kind of way. Going back to what you said earlier, we hope we get back to chaos, because I think that's what we're all shooting for right now, based on what you said earlier. But Thom, we appreciate you. We appreciate you being on. We appreciate your insight, and we'll do this again here very soon.
That sounds great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. All right, everybody, it's that part of the show, the data part of the show of the resource, where we want to be sure and provide you with resources and information that recently caught our eye to help you recruit smarter and retain better. Priscilla, what's your data point?
Yeah, so what I want to talk about is time to hire. So this is something that we look at. I'm sure most of our listeners and viewers, if you're a carrier, you look at this too. Like, what is the time to hire? And the way we look at it is from the first time that the driver connects with you. So the first time you get a short form or the phone call comes in or whatever that connection point is, all the way until the driver is actually seated in the truck. So when are they actually hired? Now, one of the things that we're seeing is the impact of, I know I talked earlier about how we're going to be talking about AI at the R&R conference, but one of the things that we're seeing is when fleets implement this advanced AI automation into their recruiting process. For us, we have a product called Lead Assist that does this. But when they implement that, it drastically impacts your time to hire, which is great because if you think about it, you have machines and computers and conversations going on with bots that are getting some information that you need that the recruiter doesn't have to do. So kind of nurturing that lead a little for you and then passing it off to a recruiter. And so the data behind that we're seeing, it can take a traditional carrier, as they hire, it can normally take from that initial connection all the way to when the driver's seated 80, sometimes even 100 days. Like, it depends. It could be pretty long process. Some do it faster, but what we're seeing is when you implement this advanced AI automation, like a lead assist tool that helps you do that, it's bringing it down to more like 30 days. So that's pretty significant, especially as we just talked to Tom about how we do get to this equilibrium, when, freight does come back. For some people, it's going to be a race to the driver, right? And so time to hire is really going to matter. So that's just kind of a data point that we've been seeing that I thought was super impactful, and how fleets just might really kind of think about that.
Yeah. To your point, I've had several people tell me, and I know there's a lot of debate, and we kind of talked about this with Tom actually offline, but there's a lot of debate about the terminology driver shortage. So however you view that, at the end of the day, everybody needs drivers. So to your point, one of the things that I've heard several people say to me is, once everything gets back to equilibrium, or we get back to chaos or normal, whatever you want to call it these days, they think that the driver shortage is going to be worse than it's ever been, because you've had people leave the industry. People are kind of jumping ship, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second. So I think your point on time to hire is extremely important, particularly as you prepare for everything to kind of get back to whatever normal is going to be these days. So that's a good point. So my data point, we've kind of been going over our Q4 data that we're going to be releasing, and the top core issue in Q4 for drivers that voluntarily left their job was, probably to not many surprise, compensation. It was about 28% of the drivers that voluntarily left their job in Q4 had mentioned compensation, and which isn't a big shock, but I kind of dug down a little bit. And if you look at the top 10 reasons from a root cause standpoint why drivers left their job voluntarily in Q4, pay rate was number two, and pay rate's kind of been one or two the last couple of quarters. As I've gone over data with our individual partners that we work with, and we mention that pay rate, everybody kind of starts scratching their head, going, "But we've raised pay, we've raised pay, we've raised pay," and all of that is true. Many companies were raising pay, during the COVID boom. And so why are drivers saying pay rate right now? And I think one of the reasons why, and one of the things that you look at when drivers are talking pay rate right now, when so many companies have raised pay, is the predictability of pay that drivers are looking for. And if you go back to our fall driver summary, for the drivers who told us that they were looking for a job, 63% of those drivers that said they were looking because they were looking for predictable pay. And that is, I think, one of the biggest things that we've seen over the last 12 months from compensation data that we have, is the lack of freight, the lack of miles, has led to a lack of predictability in pay, which is so very important to drivers. And so I guess one of the things that I would say is as we're starting the new year off, as you're talking to your drivers, whether they're currently in your trucks or whether you're recruiting them, is to really set realistic expectations with drivers when it comes to pay and miles, but especially miles in this market. Because I think what we're seeing is, we can raise pay rates all day long, but if the miles aren't there, it doesn't really matter what your pay rate is. And so I think that's one of the most important things to know. And as you're going into this year, know, yes, pay is extremely important. Miles is extremely important, but the predictability of that pay, so drivers can budget as much as they can when they're going home to pay rent, to pay bills, to cover medicine, whatever that is, that predictability of that pay is such an important thing. And I think the data in Q4 and some of the data in our fall driver survey shows that.
Yes, no, I think that's great. Rob Hatchett, the recruiting and retention consultant that we work with a lot and some of our clients work with, he always says, look at all of your pay rate, your benefits package, all of those things. Look at those every 6 months, at least, it's like your dentist checkup. That's kind of the analogy that he uses. And I think that's such a good point, especially right now, for sure.
Well, it is. And I think the other thing, and I kind of from a recruiting standpoint would be interested in your take on this, but some of the things that we see from some carriers from an advertising standpoint, and I don't think it's anybody that you guys work with, when they're out there advertising their pay, they're advertising what the top 10% earners are making. And that's great. And I'm glad that your top 10% earners are earning that much. But when you put a number out there and a driver sees that in an advertisement, as much as we all wish we were hiring a top 10% driver, we have to admit we're not. That's why they're the top 10%, not the top 90%. So we have to understand that when a driver sees that number, just like my rant on guarantee pay, when they see that number, that's what they're going to expect. So I would be really, really careful from an advertising standpoint if you're advertising what those top 10% are making, because most of the drivers you hire aren't going to be your top 10%. Let's just face it.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say, be careful on your up to, because they always say up to, you can earn up to, XYZ. So yeah, for sure. Well, this has been great. I feel like we're getting back in the groove with the new year and everything. Thanks so much for listening to the resource. If you had fun, please give us a high five by leaving a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to hit that subscribe or follow button so you never miss an episode.
And if you have any questions or feedback to share, you can hit us up on social media or shoot us an email. And we'll be back with our next episode with more fun data information to help you recruit smarter and retain better. Everybody have a great day. We'll see you next month.